First thing I want to talk about is something associated. I just want to look at one thing associated with the Emperor Trajan, and I forgot to put the name up there, didn't I? But if you've got the list, this is the column of Trajan. Obviously, it's a column, and it's the Emperor Trajan's. It's freestanding column. That's all it ever was. It's 98 foot high. It's actually a building. Technically, it's architecture. It's actually not the size of a column. It's much bigger than a real column. It's hollow, and there is a winding staircase inside that you can go all the way up to the top. So it's really a building. It's a tall, thin building in the form of a column, and it like 98 feet tall. So it's like 9-10 stories high. And
still there?
Yeah, except guess what? It originally had Trajan at the top. Guess who's at the top now? St. Peter. It's in Rome. So St. Peter. So St. Peter's at the top. It's an abomination now, a Roman column with St. Peter at the top, which is really bizarre when you really think about it.
This is in Rome?
It's in Rome.
Why didn't I ever see it?
There's a lot of stuff in Rome. It's in the forum. It's in the Forum of Trajan.
It's so skinny. I don't know how it ever survived.
Well, it might not be.
Well, being freestanding might have actually helped it.
Why am I seeing the top?
That's
Originally
original painting. No, it was originally painted. It's the imagery is the story of the Dacian War. It's one of the Roman campaigns, and it's actually a continuous band. It's like a ribbon that winds all the way up to the top of continuous scenes. It's like almost 700 feet long if you unwound all of those images. And what's really interesting is we've learned a lot.
Peggy,
Yes. Yes.
your video is breaking up and your audio somewhat, just so you know.
Okay.
Mine's okay, so it might be yours too.
Well, if it does, if you miss something important, yell at me and I'll repeat it. But no, there's really nothing we can do at this end. I'm not getting any warnings about the internet, at least not so far. So let us know.
Okay.
I got a question.
Yes.
So how do they apply the relief? I mean, is that like a plaster that they?
No,
carve into
it's
it?
carved. It's hand carved into the, this is probably, I'm not sure this is limestone or marble, probably marble, but it's hand carved. The tricky bit is this had to have been carved as a whole. You couldn't have carved drums and stacked them because the scene is spiral. So they had to be on like scaffolding or something because like 9 stories, 10 stories tall. So it was quite a feat.
Forgot his green paint.
Yeah, too bad. Yeah, too bad. Something's going to be blue. I love the photo because you never see this, of course, painted anymore. It's outside, so the paint is long gone. But what's interesting is it tells us a lot about like the Roman campaigns, what it was like. Typically, when the legions went out on a campaign, it would be 3, 4, 5, 6 years before they would get back. These were whole like cities of people. They would build like temporary cities, when they were out on campaign. And you see a lot of that. You see only actually a small percentage of this is battle scenes. Most of it is camp life. And that's what's the most interesting part of it, just like now, most of what soldiers do is fairly boring, punctuated by these moments of battle and conflict. But most of the time you're not out fighting someone, you're just waiting around to fight. And that's what you see here. So that's what makes this really interesting and an important monument. Another important monument, one that's very much a symbol of Rome. Now this is during the time of the Emperor Hadrian, who followed Trajan. Trajan was first, and Trajan was the first non-Italian emperor. He was Spanish, and so was Hadrian. This is one of those cases that I mentioned last time where Hadrian was selected to be the next emperor. He was then legally adopted by Trajan, so there would be a legal lineage there. So it was one of those peaceful transfers, everyone's in accord, you know, we get very little of that in Rome, but this period of these 5 emperors in a row, you get this peaceful transition and everyone's on the same page. Of course, this is the Pantheon, one of the most famous buildings in Rome. The way you see it now isn't what it would have looked like. You can see now that it's sitting literally below street level. That's because the city has risen up. I mean, originally it was on a fairly tall platform and there were steps going up to it. All Roman temples tend to be elevated and they have like a lot of steps going up to them, unlike the Greek. But in this case, the city is just layers and layers of city have built up and they've built right up above it. So it's like sitting down in a trench now. That's just normal. So what are we actually looking at? First of all, you can see from this entrance that it looks like the facade of a regular sort of rectangular temple, not unlike a Greek temple. But when you look and see what the back is, it's clearly not that. And I know many of you have been there, but there is an inscription here on the front, which is important. It says, Marcus Agrippa, the son of Lucius, 3 times consul, built this. Now, what you're looking at is the facade of an earlier temple that was built during the time of Augustus. There was a fire and it was damaged. And when they tore it down, they left the facade up. So that's left over from an older building, and they left it up there for one reason, and that was because of the inscription. This inscription is important. Agrippa, who's named there, was the son-in-law of Augustus, the first emperor. He was married to Augustus's daughter, and he was Augustus's sort of major sort of right-hand man. He was a consultant. He really helped Augustus. So the name Agrippa alone was linked to Augustus. Now, why did Hadrian need that up? Why did he feel the need to link himself to the great Augustus? It's a pure political move. Augustus was the most important emperor at this time. He was still thought of as the greatest emperor. Hadrian and many others after him and before him will want to link themselves to Augustus. So this is just a psychological. It's like putting up a sign, George Washington slept here, or having a plaque on the hotel with Washington's name. It's the same thing. It's a physical place where this important person was connected, and now I'm connected. So that's what it's there. It's purely political. It's a very Roman thing to do. Now, what they've actually built on the back of it, of course, is the great hemisphere or perfect sphere, actually, that makes up the Pantheon. Here's the original entrance. And then here's the hemisphere. A dome is the 3rd kind of Roman vault. Remember I said there were 3? We saw the barrel vault, the groin vault, which is 2 barrel vaults crossing, and the 3rd type is a dome, which is still based on the same structural principle as the other 2. And that's it. Every other dome that's ever been made anywhere is a variation of one of those 3. And we'll see variations of them in the Middle Ages. Roman vaults and domes are, well, domes anyway, are always perfect half spheres. Now, a dome doesn't have to be a perfect half sphere to stand up. A dome could be taller than it is wide. It could be wider than it is tall, and we'll see those. But Romans, they're always perfect half spheres. It isn't because it's the strongest, because it's not. If a dome is taller than it is wide, that's stronger. The strongest kind of dome, you want to pull it up. The weakest dome is a low dome. It's a different kind of engineering. This is a concrete building, just like we would expect, faced with marble. So it's built from concrete because of its strength and structure and durability. And Roman concrete is the strongest concrete and the longest lasting concrete ever made. Our concrete isn't anywhere near the quality of Roman concrete. And there are reasons for that. It's because we care more about, we want to span a big open space without putting in a vault or a dome. Then you need to change that flat roof. You can use a concrete, but you have to put steel in it. Steel is actually what weakens our architecture. It makes it not last as long. It's stronger when you reinforce concrete with steel, but at the same time, it oxidizes and it won't last. I mean, look how this building is and it's standing there. We don't make buildings that can stand like that, but we don't care. We don't want to make buildings that will stand like that. It's not economically feasible. We want them to last exactly as long as their economic value lasts, and then we want to be able to tear them down and build something else. So it's a totally different mindset, which is why we don't use Roman concrete. We use steel, which oxidizes. Okay. So we're seeing thick walls too. When we look at this plan, those are 20-foot thick. You know, this is experimentation. They don't know how thick the walls need to be to hold it up. So let's just be really careful and make them 20-foot thick. They couldn't, you know, go to an engineering program and plug in the numbers and find out like you can do today. It's just trial and error. And so it's overbuilt. That's why it's still, this will be the last building standing on Earth because of its engineering style, the materials, and it's just built to last. It was originally a temple dedicated to all the gods. That's what pantheon means. Pan is all, theos, so all the gods. It was the Christian church for a while. And I believe it's just a museum now, but it has served various purposes. It has no windows. That's one reason why it's so strong. The walls are not breached by any openings other than the great oculus in the middle at the top. And that's about 30 foot across. They used to refer to it as the eye. Well, that's what oculus means, eye. The eye of Jupiter is what it's sometimes referred to, but it's just an oculus, which to us means not eye, but big round window at the top. It also has a coffered dome. See these excuse me, yeah, these recesses, these are little concentric squares cut back in. They are a design element, but at the same time, they relieve the weight of the dome. They actually, you're removing about almost 50% of the weight of that dome when you put coffers in it. So they serve multiple functions, aesthetic and otherwise. And the only really way to view the interior is through a painting. We always use this. This is an 18th century painting on the right. When you're painting a scene, you can bend the space however you want to, but with a camera, even if you use a fisheye lens, it distorts the space. It's impossible. So we just use this painting where, you know, the artist just took liberties and bent it around, but it lets us see the interior. You can also see that it hasn't changed much. It certainly hasn't changed since the 18th. You know, they periodically have to replace the marble flooring, you know, bits and pieces of marble, but since it's faced with marble panels, that's easy enough to do. And, you know, the hole is still open. And I like the way, in fact, I love the way the photo on the left, the light shines in this way, and you seem to be seeing the reflection of it in the painting on the right. I just love that. Total coincidence, of course. So that is the Pantheon. And the last of the great emperors is Marcus Aurelius. And this is a bronze figure that's outside in Rome, slightly over life size. Marcus Aurelius was the last of the five. He's a really interesting person. He was a philosopher. You can buy his philosophy books. He was a really brilliant thinker, a brilliant man. He's got a full beard, which is not typical of Romans. Romans didn't really wear beards, Greeks did. But this happened to be a period where there was a kind of Greek revival. The Romans were particularly fascinated with Greece. And so beards, like Greek beards, were popular at this moment in time. This is an extremely important sculpture because it has become the model for virtually every equestrian sculpture ever made since then. I mean, you can go, where I taught in Murray, Kentucky, in the town square, there was, believe it or not, Robert E. Lee on horseback in the town square, exactly like that. I mean, it's just what you do for sculpture. Now, the biggest question that should be in the back of your minds is, if this is a bronze sculpture and it's from the ancient world and it's always been on site in public view, why does it still exist? Because I talked about the fact that bronze, we have very few bronzes because they melted them all down in the Middle Ages. So why does this still stand? It still stands because throughout the entire medieval period of 1,000 years, they made a mistake. They misunderstood who this was. They thought this was a sculpture of Constantine, and we're going to talk about Constantine in a minute. And he was a hero in the Middle Ages because he was the first Christian emperor. So this was honored as the great sculpture of Constantine. Just our luck. Later, you know, in the 19th century, archaeologists who studied it finally realized, no, that's Marcus Aurelius, and you guys were fooled for 1,000 years and didn't destroy it. So that was just a bit of luck. But he's shown in that orator stance. Remember, Augustus was standing like this in that Augustus of Prima Porta. Here, he's sort of doing the same thing. There's part of this is missing. There was originally a reclining figure on the ground underneath of that horse's hoof. Now, in this case, the raised hoof was meant to signify him staying his horse. He's pulling the horse back so that he doesn't crush the fallen enemy. This is meant to show him as benevolent, a benevolent victor. I'm not going to crush you. You're on the ground. So he's pulling the horse back. So that's what's happening here. But without the figure gone, there's no way to really understand what the message really was. But certainly beneficence was a big part of it.
There was a figure at one time.
Yeah. I'm not sure what happened to it or when it disappeared, but archaeologists, you know, I have to believe the people that did the research. They tell me there was a figure there.
Yeah, so one is on a pedestal outside.
Is this
and-
okay?
Yeah,
Because I think we can see it better.
one's on a pedestal outside and one's stuck in. a
Right,
museum
yeah.
somewhere.
It was probably brought in for cleaning or repair at some point, and they
Okay.
took that photo.
So normally he lives. outside.
Yes. And still is, I believe. He just, that they often, they'll always photograph stuff when they take it in for cleaning and repair and the like. That's in Rome too. All this stuff we've seen is in Rome. Everything's in Rome.
When I was in Rome once, they were making a copy of this with computers. They were doing it layers.
Oh, like 3D printing?
Yeah,
Oh, cool. Not a life-size one, right?
yes.
Oh my gosh. 3D printing a life-size figure like that.
I don't know where it is, but I guess maybe they're gonna take down that one. but it
Well,
was-
that would have, well, no, because they wouldn't be printing it in materials. They can't 3D print materials. They're still limited by the physical materials you can print 3D with. They're
Well, I
usually
couldn't
plastics or
understand it,
something. Yeah, they're usually,
knew that
I've
it was
seen it, but it's really
Right.
slow. You know, it can take an hour to print a little thing like this. Okay, so what happens after the 5 great emperors? Things begin to change, and what changes is, you know, the politics, the fact that Rome no longer has the great leaders it had before, and in fact, it's also fighting to maintain the empire throughout the whole 3rd and 4th centuries. They were in decline and they don't know it in the 3rd century. I mean, you don't know when you're in the middle of something, you don't know what's happening around you. I mean, especially then, we have more knowledge because we have the internet and we have communication around the world. I mean, they didn't know what was happening out on their borders, and they didn't know what was happening in China that was forcing people westward. What they're facing is something that actually had begun even a few hundred years earlier, and that was this continuous movement westward from Asia across into Europe, and large numbers of people are finally entering Western Europe, and these are basically the people that we call Europeans today. It starts as early as 300 BCE in China when the Huns are invading, and they're pushing some people a little westward, and then they push people a little westward, and it's like dominoes slowly falling. Like it's everybody take 2 steps to the left, and eventually somebody ends up in Europe. And they're pushing now, these massive populations are beginning to push on the borders of Rome. And it's not necessarily like marauding armies, it's like immigrants, it's like whole tribes of people that are moving into the area, and they're beginning to be aware of that. They're beginning to feel that pressure. One of the last sort of powerful moments in the 3rd century is a Severan dynasty, and Septimius Severus is the first. He actually chooses, we have a lot now of non-Italian emperors, and however, Trajan, Hadrian, and the Spanish emperors, they still went to Rome and ruled from Rome. But Septimius Severus, who was actually from North Africa, decided he wanted his capital here and had a whole new city built in North Africa called Leptis Magna, and that's where he ruled from. This did not go over well with the Roman population. He also took away a lot of the privileges of people living in Rome. While everyone in the empire was sort of technically a citizen, anyone living in Italy, and especially in Rome, had more privileges. And he took those away. Boy, that didn't sit well. I mean, the Senate's still there, you know, the center of the military is still in Rome. It was actually a really kind of dumb thing to do. It wasn't very politically savvy, and he didn't last too long. He was vastly unpopular. But his son, and that's who I want to talk about, Caracalla, is a far more sort of political person. And I love this sculpture. I have to say, of all Roman sculpture, I would almost have to say of all Greek and Roman sculpture, this is my favorite. This is a phenomenal piece. And you can read everything on his face. And that's why I love this. This is clearly a man trying to rule in the 3rd century, not the 2nd century. But this is a man who is, I mean, when we see it, we tend to see him as sort of brutal. Of course, he didn't mean it to be seen that way. He means to be seen as vigilant and watchful. But this is a man who has had to become more brutal. You know, as they become more threatened, they become more brutal in response, which makes them more threatening. So it's like this vicious circle, which is why nobody lives for very long in the 3rd century. But this is a stunning piece of sculpture. Now, he actually, you know, after his father, Septimius Severus, died, his brother actually took the throne, and he assassinated his own brother for the throne. This is the 3rd century we're in now. And that's just simply the way it worked. But as a savvy politician, albeit an alert one and one who's very aware of what's going on, he knows how to cater to the people. So the first thing he does is he says, no, I'm going back to Rome. He rules from Rome. You need to be the center. He reinstates those privileges that his father took away, and he makes something that's a great gift to the people of Rome. Now, exactly as Vespasian had done 200 years earlier, right, when he built the Colosseum, which was meant to separate him from Nero and make him popular with the people. This is the same thing. This is meant to separate him from his father and as a gift to the people. And it's the great baths of Caracalla. It is a thermae. Now, by this time, there are, I think all 11 aqueducts are in at this time, bringing water to Rome. Romans knew how important water was for health and safety and for fire as well, because they'd already had one great fire. But it also meant that baths started to be built, and there were probably by this time close to 300 just smaller baths or bathhouses, but there were 10 or 11 of the great thermae, and thermae just means hot water in Latin, but the thermi are on a whole different level than just a, corner bathhouse. These are massive structures, and they're opulent structures. They're open and free to the people. And the baths of Caracalla actually were not the largest one. Later, there will be one more built that's actually slightly bigger, but this was certainly the largest one to date. It had, of course, the main building and then grounds all around it. Over here, a stadium. This area was actually, I think, for training. Some of them were just workout areas. This is a gymnasium, which was a place you could go for training. All of these areas along here are hot baths and various sort of thermal baths. And you've got the great caldarium here, which was a huge dome. This building has in it all three types of Roman vaults. It has the massive dome of the caldarium, which is the hot water room. You've got the tepidarium here. This is sort of a big, here is a tepidarium. And then this is a tepidarium, this is a frigidarium. So you would go from hot water to tepid water to cold water. And then out down here is that's the natatio, that's just a big swimming pool. That's the area over here, I think, that's not roofed, it's open air. And then there are rooms for everything. There are massage rooms, there were barbers, shops, there were all kinds of different shops. There were places you could eat. There were just lecture halls. There's a great library. These two up here, those are both libraries. This is a town center. This is like a place you go for all of your activities. They were very important. They tended to be, they were open for women during the day and men in the evening is how we interpret it now. And they were just free. Men would stop on their way home, before they would go home in the evenings. Business would be done there. This is where you get together with people and do some business. I think people have a easy time understanding this today, but 30 years ago, students didn't get it because that was before everyone had a gym membership, before we had these you didn't have any place like that. They couldn't understand the concept at all. But I think it's perfectly understandable today. It's a bit more opulent than, the rec center or wherever, but it's the same, it's a similar idea. And definitely built into their lives. This is an artist's reconstruction of the great hall. The tepidarium is actually these two things here, this and this, which you just sort of dip in. Mostly it was a big open hall, and you can see by the plan, the three X's, that implies three great groin vaults above it, coffered, and again, very opulent. That's what the Romans expected. Again, concrete, faced in marble. And then this is the swimming pool, the big open swimming pool that was just for enjoyment. So this is the gift to the Roman people that Caracalla thought would placate them, but he still only got about 5 years before he was assassinated. What I love is today, this is the Baths of Caracalla today, and this is used for all sorts of things. It's staged, they'll do operas, concert performances, because apparently the acoustics is perfect. With the roof gone, the walls, I don't know what it is about it, I don't understand acoustics, but apparently, I have one live album of classical music that's from the Baths of Caracalla, and it's magnificent. So it still functions, but here's the remains of the great caldarium that would have been the domed room. And all of this and all of the steam rooms and thermal rooms, these had underground piping. There were constant fires underground running water throughout, and so hot water could come up in all the rooms. So it was a sophisticated design. The fires were constantly fed underground. And then one last building type and that is the Great Basilica. There are many basilicas in Rome. This is in many ways the most important. Basilica is a reference to a building style or an architectural style. It doesn't tell you the function of the building. Today, the word basilica is generally associated with churches because we think of the basilica at Rome, right? St. Peter's Basilica. But the word basilica doesn't mean church. It just means the style of the building. And a basilica is a longitudinal building. We'll look at the plan in just a second. What that means is it has an entrance at one end and then a focus at the other end. So when you enter the building, you're drawn down an aisle to the far end. That's the main axis, but it is the model, as clearly the model for Christian churches, as we will see. This was a multifunction building. It didn't have any one permanent function. It was just a big building space to be used in many ways. It's the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine. Maxentius actually built it. He was the emperor before Constantine. When Constantine defeated him, he actually changed the plan. The original entrance was the better plan. This is the original entrance at one end, and it even has a sort of foyer-like area, which churches typically have today, and then a long axis down the nave, the groin vaulted nave, 3 great vaults, just like the baths, and then an apse. An apse is a reference to, generally, in this case, a circular half circle platform at the end. It had a giant sculpture of Constantine in it, but it's typically where like an altar would be in a church. And that was the original. What Constantine did was he added an entrance on this side, which really screwed up the axis of the building. So then he had another apse added at this end. So you have sort of 2 axes. You have one axis going down this way and one that way. As you can see, it has a clerestory, remember that, where over the central nave, the roof line is elevated so that you can put in windows. So it has clerestory windows. This is what we're also going to see in like the cathedrals and the like later. This is where like stained glass would be, etc. It's all based on the basilica plan. So the terms nave, we still use these terms. The apse, vaults, these are barrel vaults. We'll look in, well, here you can kind of see inside, those are barrel vaults, and there are open passages between them, but it's not really what we would call a side aisle. It's just 3 barrel vaults. Here's an artist, again, drawing of what it would have looked like. Here's your great clerestory windows. A half of a dome here over the apse, and then 1 groin here, and then 1 groin for each of these 3 side bays, as they're called. So I'm introducing you to this style because we're going to see this in architecture that develops in the Middle Ages. And here's what it looks like today. There's enough standing. You can see the 3 great bays on one side and the coffers inside of them. So what happens with Constantine? Constantine is ruling at a time of great turmoil. I mean, look what's happening just between 250 and 271. This is chaos in Western Europe. You've got all sorts of different tribes. These are all the different tribes. This will narrow down. There'll be fewer tribes in a little while. Most important ones are the Franks here, who are moving into this area. And then you've got the Vandals, and there's the Goths. Moving down, and the Vandals moving into North Africa. Notice that the pressure is on this part of the empire. The west of the empire is being pressured. The east, much less so, which is why in 330, Constantine moves the capital of the empire from Rome to an old Hellenistic city called Byzantium, which is right here in an area known as the Bosporus. And he renames the city Constantinople after himself. Constantinople now replaces Byzantium, and it becomes very, very important center for the Eastern Christian world for a very long time until, in the 15th century, as we will see later, it will fall to the Ottoman Turks. And at that time, it becomes Istanbul. And so that city, Byzantine in the ancient, Constantinople in the medieval, and then later in the Renaissance and right up to today, Istanbul is really, I think, arguably the most important city in the world in terms of what it saw, what it witnessed and experienced in terms of the passage of human time. Even in places like China, where you have much older continuous cultures, there's no one place. I mean, their centers moved constantly. So there's no one Chinese city that really saw and experienced the amount of history that this city witnessed. So capital is moved. And then later Emperor Theodosius, when Theodosius, it says 395, that's an estimate, it's 398. When Theodosius died, his two sons, he sort of stipulated that it be divided between his two sons, Honorius and Arcadius. And what they did was Honorius went back and ruled from Rome. Arcadius ruled from Constantinople, and they literally split the empire. I know it's often said that Constantine split the empire. He did not split the empire. It was just one empire. It didn't become two empires until this point. Now it literally is two completely independent empires. And Honorius got the worst of the deal because, they're being swamped. This is what he faced. Arcadius over here in Constantinople is doing just fine. Look what his brother's having to face over here. He takes over he takes over in 398. 4 years later, Rome is so threatened, and it's primarily threatened by the Vandals. Now, the Vandals who have come down here into North Africa are forming a big kingdom, and look where they're living. Carthage, remember Carthage? It's now a Vandal city, and it's threatening Rome again. I mean, that's a perfect spot. If you're going to threaten Rome, that's a perfect spot because it's just a hop over here, hop across, and the Vandals are getting ready, and Honorius knows that. So in 402, he moves the capital from Rome up to a little city called Ravenna, which for a while, a few hundred years, becomes really, really important Italian city. And we're going to talk about Ravenna in some detail. It's a good thing he did, because in 410, the Vandals sacked Rome. And if he hadn't sort of formally moved the capital and gone up there himself, it would have fallen to the Vandals. It didn't, but the Vandals can't hold it very long, because then you got the Ostrogoths up here. All these people we're going to talk about soon, because this is what forms the beginning of the Middle Ages. So here we've got, now the Roman Empire is still continuing over here. They still think of it as the Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. Over here, yeah, it's sort of the Western Roman Empire, but pretty soon it becomes the Ostrogoths come down, and they even capture Ravenna, but they think of it as a Roman Empire. Now, when did the Roman Empire fall? True fact is, it never fell. It never actually fell. There were people calling themselves Roman emperors, or thinking of themselves as Roman emperors, until Napoleon defeated the Holy Roman Empire in the 19th century. I mean, technically there's no moment when, oh, it fell, on 423, it fell. It doesn't ever really fall. It changes its name. It becomes something else. It's run by it's a sort of a mosaic change, and mosaic change is where one little thing, like one little piece changes, and then another little piece, and pretty soon every little piece is changed, but you're not aware of it because it was sort of piecemeal. So this is the chaos of Europe at this time. Yes.
Is Carthage still a city before they?
I don't know, but probably.
Yes.
It may have another name.
Carthage is still.
Carthage is still there. It's recovered after the Romans salted it back in 3 something BCE. It's now quite a lot later. Good question. So out of all of this mess of people, this is what settles in pretty quickly by about 500. They're referred to as the barbarian kingdoms. Now, this is the last time I'm going to use that word because I hate it. And when you look up, all the books talk about this period in the early art, and they call it barbarian art. And I absolutely despise that terminology because it's so prejudicial. Because we know what barbarian means. What they really mean is pre-Christian. And just because somebody's not Christian yet doesn't mean you're, quote, barbarian, but that's how the term is used. So I always refer to it as pre-Christian art versus Christian art. So we're going to talk about the pre-Christian art. So here are the kingdoms that settle in. The Franks. Now, first of all of these are Germanic peoples. They may call them they're Franks, but the Frankish tribe was a Germanic tribe. So these are all Germanic peoples. They will eventually coalesce and form the French and the Spanish and others, but right now they're all just really Germanic. They all have local languages, and it's a hodgepodge and quite a mess actually at this point. You got two kinds of Goths, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. That just Visa means west, and also Austria is like east. So it's Eastern Goths and Western Goths, but they're different cultures and tribes. The Burgundians, and we know Burgundy is a northern part of Italy. I don't see the Lombards. Oh, here's the Lombards up here. They will move down in and form a part of Italy. And we'll talk about Britain as well. So what we're going to do now is take a look at these early peoples. And we'll stay in Rome first. We're going to see what happens even during the time of Constantine. Okay, here's our sort of timeline of the West and the East. So in Western Europe, we have the Roman Empire. Generally, 313 is a date we use to begin calling something early Christian art. This is sort of pre that. 313 is the date of the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal. So 313 is the date Christianity comes out into the open, comes above ground, and they start building churches and they start having open meetings. So 313 is when Christianity exists openly, but obviously it existed all of this period. It just existed underground and in secret. And we'll take a look at a couple things from this early period. The Carolingian, this is a very important period when they really start thinking of themselves as Roman emperors again, and Antonian. This is really a continuation of one empire, just ruled by different people. And then late Middle Ages, we'll later come back and look at the Romanesque and the Gothic. But this is all Western Europe. In the East now, centered in Constantinople, we have a continuous culture. The Eastern Roman Empire fairly soon becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. Because remember, the original name of the city is Byzantium, and people just didn't forget that. Even though it's changed its name to Constantinople, people still think of it as Byzantium. So it's known as the Byzantine Empire. But it is, understand, it's just a continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. And they were quite aware of that as well. 1054 is the Great Schism. Up until this point, there is one Christian church. It's existing in Western Europe. It's also existing in the East. However, there have been differences between them right from the beginning. They've never been on the same page. But in 1054, they make it official and they split. That's the Great Schism. That's when we now have officially the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, one centered in Rome, one centered in Constantinople. And then, of course, 1453, Constantinople becomes Istanbul, but it's still the center of the Eastern Orthodox Christianity. This is the Great Schism. This is roughly sort of where the divide lay. It's really a kind of further cementing of this distinction we have between East and West You know, we always talk about the West versus the East. Well, where's the line? Where does something become the East versus something become the West? And that understanding that there's a difference between East and West goes back to the great migrations of the peoples when they were coming into the West, when Constantine moves to the East, but then especially when Theodosius and his sons split the empire. There's the Western Empire and the East. It's sort of the beginning of our whole consciousness of Western culture versus Eastern culture. This is sort of where it's rooted. And this is now the Christian church expressing that same division. Okay, so in Rome, there is certainly Christian imagery and Christian art before 313, before it's legal. It tended to be what we call crypto-Christian, crypto meaning that it's coded somehow in secret. Crypto-Christian imagery, one of the most popular images was the shepherd. Now, the image of the shepherd carrying a sheep, today, most people would kind of think of that as a Christian image. It's become one of those sort of symbolic forms, Christ as the good shepherd, etc. However, it's a very ubiquitous image throughout antiquity. Now, we didn't look at them, but there are plenty of small Greek sculptures of shepherds. Can I ask that everybody please mute your computers so that we don't hear everything in everybody's rooms? Thanks. So the fact that someone would own a sculpture of a shepherd like that would not have necessarily said to anyone, oh, this person must be Christian. So it's a code, like a Christian visits you and sees that, they get it, you know, wink, wink, I get it, you're a Christian. But if someone else saw it, they wouldn't necessarily make the connection. So that's what made this image and this theme one which rose very early as a popular image, because you could conceal, you could use it to conceal who you are, as opposed to having a big cross there or something. So that's where the Good Shepherd comes from. One other thing you notice is that throughout early Christian art, Christ is always shown as a beardless youth. If you want to, this is true in all ancient art, a beardless man means you're young. That's how you symbolize age. If you're older, you have a beard. If someone doesn't have a beard, he's young. So beard, no beard just symbolizes age. So that's everywhere. So the idea that a youthful Christ is really the early image that you see. The other thing that we don't see in early Christian art is any images at all of the Passion of Christ or the crucifixion. I'm not going to say there are none. It's a slight transition, but it's going to be not until after about 1000 that you begin to see images of the crucifixion. The crucifixion does not play a huge part in the narrative of Christianity. I know that's very hard to understand today, because that's sort of like the key that you focus on, but it was not for almost 1000 years. It was not. The focus was on benevolence. It was not on the suffering and death of Christ. It was on something like the Good Shepherd and helping your friends. And, you know, it was a much more positive. Christianity becomes very dark after about 1000 with the shift of emphasis. And we'll talk about that and look at imagery and see why that happens. But these are early images. Churches begin to be built at this time as well. Now in Rome, of course, they're going to look around them at what architecture exists, and some of the earliest churches are going to embrace the basilica plan. Now there are two types of architectural plan: longitudinal and central. A longitudinal plan, like the basilican plan, is, as I said, it's long, is an entrance on one end, the focus is on the far end, and you're pulled in to the other end of the church. You pull down. A central plan or centralized plan is the Pantheon is a good example of a centralized plan. It's going to either be round or square or octagonal. It typically has a dome. And instead of, when you enter, being pulled to something at the far end, the focus is in the middle of the building and your attention is pulled up to that dome in the middle. It's a different relationship to the space and movement within the architecture. Now, in the West, the longitudinal plan will dominate Christian church design. But as we look at some structures in the East, for example, in Constantinople, the central plan will dominate because that's rooted in architectural styles more from the East. But there are some Western centralized plans, but not many. Mostly longitudinal, it's fairly recognizable as a style. The first Christian church ever built during the time of Constantine was this. Now remember, 313 is when it becomes legal. So, this had to have been, planned and begun pretty quickly after that. It's Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and it stands on, or it stood, pardon me, on the same site as the current St. Peter's Basilica. That was built directly over it. In fact, the altar of the current church is directly where the altar was of this church, and that has to be because beneath that altar is the burial tomb of St. Peter. So the altars are specifically located, and then the church is sort of built around the altar. So the altar that has to be placed directly over that tomb. As you can see, it is a very typical basilica plan. It has a large open atrium in the front. This is more medieval style than Christian style. Medieval building, pardon my language, Mediterranean. I didn't mean medieval, Mediterranean. It's a Mediterranean style, an open atrium. We then get the interior, and we'll look at this a little bit more, a clerestory with windows here. What is new and what churches will have, which Roman basilicas didn't, is the transept, this thing right back here. That wasn't there, this transept. And the Roman basilica didn't have this, has the apse, but this crossing arm here, aisle, known as a transept, you will see in all Christian churches. In this case, it has baptistry as well. Baptistries, and I don't know when this stopped, so before you ask, I don't know, but at least through the 15th, 16th century, baptistries were separate buildings, and they were always round buildings. Sometimes they were attached to the church, sometimes they sit next to it. But there are baptistries like the baptistry in Pisa, etc., going up into the 15th century that are separate buildings. Now, the reason they are round is because there's a tradition for martyriums. Martyriums are round buildings that are associated with martyrdom, martyrs. So if a church is known as a martyrium, it's over the tomb of a martyr, then it will often be round. And baptism was associated with martyrdom. You die and are reborn. So you're a martyr in a sense when you're baptized. So that's the logic anyway for why baptistries were round like martyriums are. So when you see these little round buildings next to churches, that's where they come from. So on the plan now, we still have the nave. And now these side aisles, that instead of bays that are really separated, now it's just open and we just have aisles. Sometimes they have one side aisle, sometimes two side aisles, and of course the transept. Now, in terms of what it looked like inside, well, it's gone, we don't know. But this is actually a print that was made of the interior of, I forget the name of it, but it's another church that was built at this, just only slightly after Old St. Peter's and not far from it. So the assumption is it probably looked a lot like this inside. You can see a number of things that are different from Roman architecture. Christian churches, Roman architecture was concrete, marble faced with vaulting, right? Not so Christian churches. They are brick buildings. So this was a brick building, not concrete brick, regular brick made from mud and other sort of materials, just plain regular red brick. It probably had some marble facing on it, but It didn't have vaulting. Vaulting is not going to appear for quite a while again before vaulting comes in. It had flat wooden ceilings and roofs, which was a problem because Christian churches burned down all the time, where Roman buildings didn't. They use materials, but when you have a building that's brick with a lot of wood and open flames everywhere, there's a lot of fire. So you can see flat roof, wooden, really quite different. Also from this early period, this is a sarcophagus, and it's a really good example of early Christian style. You know, one of the problems early Christians had in beginning to make, art now is, what should Christian art look like? What is Christian art? Is it just Roman art? Are we just continuing what the Romans did? Because they had a very strong sense that they weren't Roman. That do you need the light? Should I put the light back on? Bonnie, would you like me to put the light back on? You're
I'm
cool.
fine.
Okay. They had a clear sense that they are different from the ancient world, and fairly quickly on, they sort of slowly morph into a greater and greater abstraction. Remember Greco-Roman art, and now I'm going to link Greek and Rome together because compared to medieval, they're very similar. Was based on naturalism. People looked like people, and early Christians began to equate natural physical appearance with a pagan world. If these pagan Greeks and Romans, they were tied to the physical world, right? So they're depicting accurately what they see, but that's a pagan way of valuing the world you live in. As Christians, we want to focus on the spiritual, not the physical. And therefore, if naturalism is what pagans focus on, then we as Christians want to find forms that express the physical and that express the spiritual and reject the physical. And that's going to lead them to greater and greater distortion and abstraction of form as a way of expressing not the physical world. They're rejecting the physical world. It's not fully done here. They're still tied to Rome. It's a slow process. This is 359. He's still tied to Roman styles. However, there are peculiarities here that are not fully natural. The figures are disproportionate. They're sort of squat, kind of doll-like proportions. It's not something you would have seen in Greece or most of Rome. As a sarcophagus, this is like a coffin, but it would have been slid into like a niche, and therefore it's only decorated on one side because it would have been pushed back into a wall niche, so you didn't need to see any other side. Now, Junius Bassus was a prefect of Rome who converted to Christianity. What we see here are a bunch of scenes or images that seem to be somewhat randomly chosen from both the Old and New Testament. We've got scenes like in the upper left is Abraham and Isaac, which is a scene of sacrifice. A lot of them deal with sacrifice. The next one, that's Peter arrested. I'll come back to that middle one because that's a really important one. Over here, Christ is condemned. So we've got Old Testament, New Testament. Over here, Christ is brought before Pontius Pilate. Down below, over here, we're jumping back to the Old Testament. This is Job, which again deals with sacrifice. Way back now, Adam and Eve. Down here, now it's Christ entering Jerusalem. Now we're back to the Old Testament. Now we've got Daniel in the lion's den. And then over here, Paul is arrested. So now we're back to the New Testament. So it's a mixing of Old and New Testament, but not in any particular way other than they all seem to suggest somehow sacrifice. I mean, that seems to be it. Certainly, Daniel in the lion's den is often parallel to Christ, and the suffering of Christ and the rebirth of Christ is often parallel, but we'll talk more about that idea later. The most intriguing scene here is this one, the one in the middle, where we have Christ seated on a throne, two figures on either side. He is shown as the King of Heaven on a throne. Now, rarely when we think of later Christian art or, Renaissance, Baroque, things we're familiar with, you don't see Christ seated on a throne. That's not a traditional scene. It's one that's shown very early, and it's taken from ancient traditional scenes, particularly of images like Zeus on a throne and Jupiter on a throne. That's sort of the motif. What we're actually seeing here is they are borrowing scenes and motifs, I should say, and recontextualizing them. This is not uncommon between different religions. It's sort of taking one, it's called syncretism, where you take a theme or a motif and then you recontextualize it into the story that you want. So there is a tradition for that.
Well, he has his foot on somebody's head.
Doesn't he? Who do you think this is? You have somebody down here and he's holding this sort of billowing sort of fabric that creates almost like a dome. Who do you think that is? It's definitely a pagan god. It's been identified as Coleus, as the god of the heavens or something, but it almost doesn't matter. The point is it's a pagan god. That's the most, and he's got his foot on his head. So it's generally interpreted as a symbol of Christianity coming in and replacing the old gods. The problem is that's a problem for later Christians. You're never going to see this again, because what it's suggesting is that there were old gods. Christians don't believe there ever were old gods. It's not like Jesus came in and beat up Zeus and Jupiter.
Maybe it's Satan.
No, it's not. It's a god. No, Satan, no, it's not Satan. But that's a good possibility, because there are places, but this isn't it. He's clearly a Roman god. This is how they were depicted. So just the fact that Junius Bassus, in his mind, he's a new Christian. He's lived in a world of the Roman gods. So in his mind, one god has come in and supplanted the other god. And what I find most interesting, when we took that course with Kendall and we read the Old Testament, which, my God, everybody should read that. It's not at all what I thought it was. It's really about all these other gods. What I had no idea the Old Testament was full of all these other gods, and the Christian God replacing them.
We remember from that the early Christian families, although they were Christian, they hung on to some of the, we just laughed about the kitchen god and.
Yeah.
Still hung on to it.
Absolutely. But to me, like in the New Testament context, any reference that there even were other gods was, you just didn't do that. But the Old Testament, the first time I read it, and it talked about these different gods and what? and the whole idea that there was only one God is not original. That is something that comes in much later, and it had to do with, and I can never remember the details, but some conquest by the Babylonians. And when they were finally freed, they went back and they brought wives with them that worshipped other gods. Yeah, right, the pantheon.
Judea and took slaves back with them.
And they married them too, because I remember some of their wives. And that's when the church said, wait a minute, this has got to stop. There's only one God. There's only ever been one God. But that is quite late before the church says there has only ever been one God. So it's a revelation, no pun intended. So this is very much something that identifies it as quite early. Okay, let's take a look at the East. Before we look at Western Europe, I want to look at the Byzantine, and I don't want to spend a lot of time there because it lasts a very, very long time, 1,000 years. So we're not going to look at
Skip
a
through
whole,
that.
yeah, we're going to just skip through the 1,000 years because our focus really is on Western Europe, and that's the development I really want to spend most time on. But I do want to talk about Emperor Justinian, who was really of the early emperors, the most important. And Justinian is ruling from like in the 6th century, let's just say in the 6th century, in the 500s. And his principal capital is, of course, Constantinople. But Justinian had early on the goal of reuniting East and West. In fact, even in the West, that goal doesn't really end for a long time. They hold on to this possibility that Rome could unite once again, and East could unite with West, and there could be a grand Roman Empire once more. It's never really going to happen, but Justinian comes the closest because he does conquer a lot of territory. He takes back East, North Africa, around here, and all of Italy. And of course, the time he does it, Ravenna is the capital of the West. So he sets up his secondary capital in the city of Ravenna. So we're going to look at one church in Constantinople and one church in Ravenna before the Byzantines are pushed back out again. They'll hold on for quite a while. They won't hold on to Ravenna for very long, but they'll hold on to bits and pieces of southern Italy for quite a while. So the church I want to look at in Constantinople is the church of Hagia Sophia. I want to point out that the Byzantine world is a Greek-speaking world. The Latin is centered in Rome in the West, but the Byzantines are Greek speakers. And so a lot of Greek words and Greek language, we'll see that everywhere. In fact, that association will hang on for a very long time. So Hagia Sophia, Hagia it means holy. Sophia means wisdom. So it's the Church of Holy Wisdom. Hagia is also used for the word saint. So this is often translated as the Church of Saint Sophia. But it's not really dedicated to a woman named Sophia. Sophia means wisdom in Greek. It's dedicated to the idea of wisdom or holy
Is this
wisdom.
Eastern Orthodox Church or Christian Church?
Eastern Orthodox is Christian.
Well, okay, I'm sorry, Roman.
No, this is Constantinople. This is just Christian. At this time, there's only
Oh,
one.
okay, okay,
There
there's
is no
a
split
there's a
till
split,
after
okay,
1000.
I'm
So
sorry.
it's just Christian, no different from any other. In theory, in
Mhm.
reality, the
Mhm.
Eastern Christianity was always practiced differently,
Mhm.
and we'll see that difference fairly early on. When you look at it here, I need you to block out the 4 minarets. Those were added, of course, much later when it was a mosque, after it became Istanbul. So those were not there originally, clearly. Yeah, I know it's hard to do. I don't have my Photoshop anymore, but I've always wanted to just go in and Photoshop those out. But they're such a part of the way people see it today. It would probably look strange without it. So let's see, what are we looking at here? A very large and very complicated building. This is the official church of the emperor. It is meant to be large and showy and opulent, and it's meant to challenge other churches. Constantinople was often referred to as the New Rome, and he did a lot of new building in the city, and he really wanted to rival Rome. There's a lot of politics in this as well. He hired people to build this. The architects were told to come up with whole new building engineering. One architect was a specialist in geometry and optics. Another one was a specialist in physics and vaulting. And so he needed it to be something no one had seen before. And this is what we're looking at. It's a central, it's actually it's a hybrid plan. It's not really longitudinal. It's not really centralized. And I say that because we have an entrance here on one side and there is an apse over here. So in theory, there is an axis that runs this way. However, it has a central dome and 4 massive pillars and it's square. So there's also an emphasis in the center and it pulls your eye straight up. So it's a hybrid, and it's unique in that, that it is a kind of hybrid of both styles of building. Symbolism in Christianity in the East centered a lot at this time on light, and he needed a building with a lot of light, but he also wanted a dome structure that would rival the Pantheon. And we know the Pantheon didn't have windows and had just that one oculus. So he needed someone to figure out how to have a big dome and lots of windows. So figure out how to do that, architects. This is your challenge. And they did it. They figured out how to do it. And it's a whole new style of structure. And we'll look at the engineering in a minute. First of all, it's a series of domes. You have the one central dome that identifies the naos is actually another word for cella, which was the Greek word for the central area in a Greek temple. So it's Greek, so we're using all those Greek terms. And this is the central dome. And then as you can see here, right at the spring point, remember the spring point is the weakest point, right here at this spot where it becomes vertical and curving. So right at this spot, there are a series of 4 half domes, which you see one of them right here. And then right at the spring point of the half domes, there is another little half dome that springs out right here. So what you've got is an architectural form that takes that downward thrust and it's sort of like a cascade out and out and out. It reminds me of like a champagne fountain where you pour the champagne at the top and then it just goes out and out and out. And it carries that weight in really interesting ways. Now he wanted it tall, much taller than the Pantheon, and he wanted the powerful dome. Now the problem is, this is really, and he wanted it done fast. He was always like fast. This is a brick building, and he was pushing him so fast that they weren't allowing the mortar between the bricks to dry properly. And they started having problems very early on. One of the sidewalls started bowing out. See these 2 great big things right here? Those are buttresses that were added after the fact because this wall was falling out because it hadn't set properly. The first dome fell in 558. So like after about 25 years, the first dome fell and they built a taller dome because the first dome was shallower. And remember I said the shallower the dome, the weaker it is. So they built a taller dome and that one stood. So now it's fine. But originally it had some issues because largely because he was pushing him too hard to move too fast. Now let's take a look at inside. So I want to point out these big black things right here, these 4, because they are supporting a lot of the weight compared to the Pantheon. And this is pretty close to scale in terms of their relationship. The dome is smaller than the Pantheon, but it's taller. Because remember, the Pantheon is a perfect sphere. This is not. So he got his taller dome, but it is not bigger, but the interior is much bigger overall. So here's the inside. Now, again, a lot of these medallions and things were added. A lot of the original paintings of angels and things were sort of whitewashed out. So it doesn't look exactly the way it would have looked before. But you do notice the light, and there's a lot of light around the dome. You don't pierce the side of a dome. Romans said you don't pierce the side of a dome, you need it. But this is built using these ribs. See those individual ribs? They're really what's holding all the weight. And there's the material in between those ribs is lighter weight. So you could put a window there. There are ways you can pierce a dome.
Now, are
This
those
is it.
windows glass? Or just
Yes,
like-
they're glass. Don't ask me if anybody ever cleans them. I don't know, but they're glass windows. Okay, so here's the central now. These walls we're looking at here, these are what we call curtain walls. They don't support anything at all. And since they're not bearing any weight, you can just put all the windows in them you want. That's right here. In fact, it doesn't even show up as a wall on the plan. It's right here and right here. So you can pierce the sides of those. Windows all over the place. So how do we support the weight of this dome? The Pantheon stood on a single solid drum. It's called a drum, this solid wall all the way around. The Pantheon was a dome on a drum. This is not. There's nothing supporting or below this dome. So where's all the weight being held? It's being held on those four piers by the use of what are called pendentives. And this is their new invention, Pantheon dome on drum. In the Pantheon, every bit of the weight of the dome is equally divided along every point of the wall. There's no like more weight on this side of the wall than on that side. It's equally divided. Here, the weight of the dome is divided into quarters, and each quarter is funneled and redirected down to one of these four pendentives. Now, those pendentives, those piers that hold them up are going to be massive. When you look inside, you can see them. Here's the pendentives. So the weight from this point to this point, which is 1/4 of the dome, is funneled down onto this pier, and then you can quarter each part of the dome. Now, wrong way. When we look inside, where are those massive piers? It's right here. This is one massive pier. But what they've done is disguised the weight of that one massive pier by breaking up the surface into all these separate little rectangular areas. Now, this is quarried stone. These piers are not brick. Just the outer walls are brick, but the four massive piers are made out of quarried limestone, much stronger than brick. And that's what we have built here. All of the surfaces of this building are covered in order to make it look lightweight. This is supposed to look weightless. I mean, that's the symbolism, light pouring in. It's not a heavy, massive thing. It's meant to look like there's no weight here at all. So the surfaces are divided. I've said this before, it'll come up again in art. If you want to disguise the mass of something, you want to draw attention to the surface of it. So by drawing attention to the surface with these inset, beautiful, separate little marble panels, you're taking the attention away from the huge mass of the pier that's behind it. So this is the structure and the architecture. This is a building designed for show. This is a building of spectacle. This is where the massive Byzantine court, which was massive and opulent and luxurious, for a church service here, the emperor and all the court would come in their regalia, and they would be observed from these balconies by people seeing them. It's spectacle. This is where the spectacle of church, and particularly the emperor, who was head of church and state, ostensibly in Constantinople, is seen. So a very important church that links church and state and turns it into theater to a great extent. Now, his secondary capital over here in Ravenna. Now, this is just a much smaller town, but he wants to build something there that will be, the symbol of his presence. Now, remember, Honorius moved the capital there from Rome in 402, and it's going to fall to the Ostrogoths. They're going to move down and capture it in 476. And so by the time Justinian comes along, he can say, well, that's not really the Roman Empire. There are foreign invaders ruling the West, so I have to go free the West. So he saw it not as invading the West, but of liberating the Western Empire from these barbarian Ostrogoths. But by this time, they're all Christianized. They weren't barbarians, and they thought of themselves as the Roman Empire too. But, you know, conquerors will typically find a way to think of themselves as liberators. It's simply how you write history. So that's why he suddenly felt that it was his right. So he builds this, or has built this little church called San Vitale, which is dedicated to Saint Vitale. Now, he was a local saint, not well known at all, sort of from that area. It's an interesting little central plan. On the one hand, it can be seen as a martyrium because Saint Vitale is buried beneath the altar there. On the other hand, it's a sort of Byzantine style because that's what they all were building in the East. So it's a little Byzantine church in Italy, right in the middle of Italy. It's octagonal. It's an interesting design with a dome and a clerestory. So the central is elevated with these little exedra. Exedra is just a term for these sort of curving niches that expand out. What are called it? It's a strange design because for some reason the narthex, or the entrance here, is off center. I don't know why it's not placed on center. It could be the topography. I've not been there, so I don't know. Maybe there's a reason. But anyway, it's built like this, sort of off center, and then there are two entrances here. A longitudinal church would be thrown off, but this isn't really longitudinal. It's a central church anyway, or somewhat of a hybrid. Because you still have an apse at one end. What I really want to focus on is the interior of this church, because it's absolutely filled with Byzantine mosaics. Mosaics are a major art form in the Byzantine world. It's not an art form you see develop in the West. It's not a European art form. It's Byzantine. It's why this is rare in Italy. It's because it is a Byzantine church that happens to be in Italy, but every surface is covered with mosaics. And mosaics, of course, are made from little, what we call tessera, little cut pieces of glass. By this time, they're using glass. Mosaics in the ancient world, Greece and Rome, they had mosaics, but they used stone, cut stone. The Byzantines used glass, which is far more reflective and far more magical. And when they place the mosaic, they're also putting them on the wall, where ancient mosaics tended to be on the floor. They were floor mosaics. That's what you saw in Greece and Roman villas and the like, were floor mosaics. But these are Christian scenes and images, and we don't want people walking on them. So they're really a thing for the walls and the like. And when they're placed on the wall, they're often placed at slightly different angles to one another intentionally. They're not smooth. And that is so that the light from candles will flicker across the surface. It's that mysticism of light, again, flickering across the surfaces. They're absolutely stunning. And this is toward the altar. And we're going to look at one mosaic up here. It's right, it's hard to see, but there's a mosaic right here and then another one right across from it. It's this one here on the left that we're going to look at. This is a mosaic of Emperor Justinian himself, and this is one of Empress Theodora. But for time, we're just going to look at the Justinian side, and this is it right here. So it's over life size. And it's now typical of the Byzantine style, where you have elongated figures. The whole Byzantine style is very influenced by the fact that the majority of the work is mosaic, because mosaic as an art form is very flat. It tends to be flat. It's not a form where you can do subtle shifts of color and modeling of form. It tends to be quite flat. And so this is the style that develops, where we get very flat figures that are not grounded in space. I love their feet, which seem to just sort of dangle down there. And so I want to talk about the subject and who these people are and why they're placed the way they are and why they look the way they are. So we have Emperor Justinian in the middle. Now, it's very likely that at least some of these are slightly portraiture. In other words, they're slightly meant to at least look a little bit like this person because they're important and need to be recognized. Like Justinian, over here we have Maximianus. In fact, his name is up here, Maximianus. He is the most important religious figure in Italy at this time. These men here are other clergy, important clergy, and it does appear that there are some individual qualities here that probably look a bit like them. And these two as well. These two symbolize and possibly are specific barons. They symbolize sort of the secular power at the time. So these are the landowners, the important secular world. And then we have the army back here, the military. Now, these are clearly not, they all look alike. These are clearly just nameless soldiers, but now they're Christian soldiers. You've got the chi and the rho here that identifies them as Christian soldiers. So what we have is the emperor, the clergy, and the secular. And what Justinian is really doing is pulling together these three major powers. In fact, the sacred and the secular are the support that he needs to be emperor, to maintain his position. He needs both the Christian world and its leaders and the secular world and its leaders. And so that's how he's showing himself here. So this is a political statement in terms of who he is bringing together as his retinue. Now, it's meant to be a procession. He's carrying a golden platen, which was a gift from the emperor for the church. And this is that golden plate that the Eucharist would be carried on at the time of the sacrament of the Eucharist. So the host, the consecrated host, would be laid out on this platen. So he's made a gift of it. And in the image that's across from it, of his wife, Empress Justinian, she's carrying the golden chalice. So they gifted the church the platen and the chalice, which are used in, holy sacrament of the Eucharist. So the procession, so how do we read it as a procession? We're meant to read it like a V coming at you, not going right to left or left to right, but Justinian is in front. And then sort of behind him are, the secular and the priest, and then the soldiers. And now, how are we supposed to know to read it that way? You have to look at who's overlapping who. That's how you read space here. Justinian is overlapping everyone, only just slightly. You can clearly see that this was a difficult design because someone had to balance this power relationship between Maximinus and Justinian. Justinian's the emperor, but Justinian wasn't actually there. And the fact is, Justinian never stepped foot, not only not in Ravenna, he never stepped foot in Italy in his life. This is his symbolic presence in Italy, his symbolic presence in Ravenna, but he's still the emperor. However, Maximianus is still around, and he's without a doubt the most powerful member, position at that time in the church in Italy. So we see Justinian's overlapping him here, but down here, his feet seem to be in front of Justinian. So there's a little give and take spatially in terms of the symbolism of space. Clearly, Maximianus, who seems to be stepping right on this guy, and their legs are kind of overlap. But if you look at the feet, you can see clearly overlap. You can also see it makes no sense, because if these feet belong to this guy, he's behind this guy, but his feet are in front of that guy. So, but what you really see is it's not about reality. It's not about the physicality of the event. It's about the spiritual nature of that event. And that's what is true of all medieval art. Medieval art is never about showing you how something happened. It's about telling you the spiritual meaning of that event. And that's how they separate themselves from the pagans who were interested in what things really looked like, that attachment to the physical realm. I think you can see these tessera here more clearly. I also want to point out this, the importance of this gold leafing in the background. One thing we will continuously see in medieval art, two-dimensional medieval art, is the role that gold plays. Gold as a background becomes an actual language. It becomes a spiritual symbol that this is not the real world. I don't want to call it a symbol of heaven. It's too literal. It's a little vaguer than that. It symbolizes that an event is taking place in a spiritual, timeless realm, as opposed to grounding it in a physical place. So we're not going to see blue skies in medieval art, not until way at the end. And when you start seeing blue skies, you know something's changing. Events are being now interpreted in a different way. So you're not going to see, anyway, this will be clearer, but it's already beginning here. Now, the way the gold leaf in particular will flicker, because these tessera are actually clear glass, and gold leaf is placed on the back of it so that the light is actually penetrating through the clear glass, bouncing off. Now imagine all these at different angles, and then candles are lit in front of it. Talk about mystical. The light would just flicker back and forth and all around. And that would further take the story into this realm, this spiritual realm. And the fact that, the truth of the fact that he was never actually there at all, that it is just symbolic. So beautiful, I think the finest example of Byzantine mosaics, but we're also going to look at one other truly, purely Byzantine art form. Mosaics is one that is not Western. The other is icons. The icon tradition, which is one that developed in the Eastern Church, never took root in the West, and was always really even quite controversial in the East. Now, this is an early icon, a rare early icon, because it actually dates from before the iconoclastic controversy, which I'll talk about in a minute. So it's a pre-controversy icon, and there aren't many of those. This is painted on a wooden panel. It's painted in tempera. And I'll talk a bit about how these are made in just a few minutes when we look at another one. It's an image of the Theotokos, again, Greek term, which means bearer of God. It refers to a particular motif, the motif in which the Virgin Mary is seated on a throne. It's sometimes referred to as the Queen of Heaven motif, where she is seated on a throne, but then the child is seated on her lap as if she is his throne. So she is the bearer of Christ. She's the throne upon which he sits, in the same way that she's seated on a throne. Now, what identifies this particular icon as early is because of the number of people that are in it. As we're going to see, icons are generally one or two people. Generally, the Virgin Mary and Christ child is the most common, or Saint Matthew or one saint. There rarely this many people. Only a really early one would have this. And also, there are still remnants here of naturalism. When you look at the faces, there's shading, there's highlights, the features are still rounded. It may look very abstracted compared to the Greco-Roman art we looked at, but compared to later medieval, this is still quite tied to the natural world, particularly the modeling of the features, the three-dimensional nature of the features. Now, icons played an important role in Christianity. They were aids to meditation. This is how they were defined. Whether it was a saint, or in this case, the Virgin and Child, the point is you were meant to think about them. Meditation played a huge role in Christianity for a very long time. And I think it's kind of coming back in some churches. Since the 60s, meditation has a higher sort of visibility point across Western culture in general. And I think it's worked its way back into the Christian church. But it played a role in early church, although it wasn't sort of Buddhist meditation. It wasn't the sort of just turning inward and not focusing on your breath. It was, you were meant to meditate on a specific idea, whatever the image in the scene was. It reminds me very much of like Tibetan thangkas, which have very specific like, sort of individuals, all sorts of symbols. And, you know, once you're trained as to what all those mean, then you can focus on that. You know, part of your visualization is about that image. It's very, very much like that. But what began happening not long after this period, sort of as we get into the 8th century, people began questioning that, like at what point does meditation become worship? At what point are you worshiping that image? At what point does it become idolatry, which of course is banned, idolatry. You're not supposed to have, you know, graven images, which means exactly that, a drawn or painted image. So at what point? And this became very controversial in the East. And so we get, oh, here's that trope. I forgot I had this image. Remember, we looked at this, we looked at Egypt. I said I'd bring it back. The origin of the Theotokos image is the very well-known image of Isis with Horus on her lap, where she is his throne, or she is holding him. That's where the image of the Virgin Mary comes from.
We know who those two people are.
Yes, we do. It is Saint Theodore over here, and over here is Saint George, and they are two warrior saints. They both have Theodore and George.
St. George, I know, but I've never heard of St.
Oh, there's a saint everybody. There are, no, I'm serious. There are hundreds and hundreds of saints. There are saints that are just this one little village knows of this one saint or something. There are an infinite number of saints. So yeah, you start studying art, you discover there's a whole lot of saints you never heard of, especially if you weren't raised Catholic. But even if you were raised Catholic, there's a whole lot more that most people don't know of. So yeah, there are just lots and lots of them.
Well, they're still pointing new ones.
Yeah, they're still pointing new ones, right? And they don't take many away. You know, I mean, Christopher is the only one I can think of who got demoted. Usually they don't get demoted, they just get more added on. So let's talk about the iconoclastic controversy. The emperor, this controversy was growing and growing. And finally, the emperor at the time in 726, and I don't remember who he was, it doesn't matter who he was. Okay, it was Leo III, banned icons in 726. You could have no images of Virgin Mary, Christ, or the saints, or anything like that you would use, because of course the difference between veneration and idolatry, and you would meditate on them otherwise. So here's where we get the terms, again, Greek terms, iconoclasms. That's why it's called the iconoclastic controversy. Icon just literally means image in Greek, an icon. So iconoclastic means the breakers of images. These were the people who wanted them destroyed, and they were destroyed. Masses of them were destroyed. That's why an early one from before that is rare, because most got destroyed. Fortunately, the imagery in many of the churches, things like mosaics and the like, what they did was they whitewashed over them. They didn't destroy them, thank goodness. So we didn't lose a lot of that. It's much easier just to paint over the image than to try and, you know, break out all those mosaics. And so they were destroyed. The iconoclast refers to the people who did it, and the iconophiles were the people who didn't want them destroyed. And this went on for 117 years until it is ended. And the decree was ended when a later emperor died. His wife, the empress, she lifted the ban. He didn't want to, that emperor. When he died, she jumped in real quick. She was regent for a short period and she jumped in and lifted the ban. But clearly popular opinion had shifted that way. Now, this controversy within the Christian church, because there is only one Christian church, yet it didn't exist in the West. There was no controversy in Rome or anywhere else. And they didn't have icons, but they had plenty of images, but they paid no attention to what was going on in the East. So clear sign in the 8th and 9th century, even though officially there's one church, there were clearly already two churches acting independently, because the ban certainly didn't carry over into Western Europe. This is a later manuscript, and later we're going to look at a lot of manuscripts later because they're really beautiful things. But what I love about this manuscript is, see, notice it's written in Greek. All of the manuscripts from Western Europe we're going to look at are all written in Latin. This is one from the East, so it's written in Greek. But it's the image I want to point to. What we've got here is a rare. Now, I debate whether this is not really an image of the crucifixion, even though it's Christ on the cross, because the artist is not trying to depict the crucifixion. That what he's trying to depict is this guy down here who is attempting to whitewash an image of Christ, which is meant to be a mosaic image on a church wall. Now, this is after the ban is lifted. So he's attacking the iconoclasts. He's saying what this guy did to the image of Christ is as bad as what these guys did to the body of Christ, where these soldiers are using these spears to pierce him. He said, you're doing the same thing. You hurt Christ when you destroyed these images, when you painted over them. So he's linking the iconoclast to, the Romans who are, killing Christ on the cross. And I just find that so interesting that, right after the ban is lifted, we see, in the mid-9th century, we've got them now. It's a backlash. It's a total backlash against the iconoclast, which is why I don't consider this a scene of the crucifixion, because that's a secondary. He's just trying to make a point. He's not really trying to depict it. And the last icon I want to look at is the most famous of all, the Virgin of Vladimir, which is to me the archetypal icon ever made. This is the motif that is known as the Virgin of the Compassion. It's a more typical subject. This was made in Constantinople. It found its way to Moscow at some point, and then was taken to Kiev, or Kyiv as they're pronouncing it now, I think. And then it made its way to a small Russian village called Vladimir. And so it's in Moscow now in a museum, but it had a long history. That's how it got to be known. I have this on an exam once for an identification, and one of the students identified it as Vladimir and the baby. I got lists and lists of funny things that students have written. Oh, you wouldn't believe. They're hysterical. I'll bring some more into you as we get there.
Half credit for that. You have the Vladimir part.
Vladimir and the baby. You want to go,
Which is which.
what are you thinking? It's like, just use your brain for 2 minutes and look at it. No.
I know, that's what I was just kidding, because the baby is so weird.
Okay, let's talk about the weird baby. Now, this is 12th century. So, we've jumped way. This is a fully developed medieval style. This is sort of at the height of medieval art, fully developed. No relationship, but not much relationship to the natural world here. That's clearly very intentional. There are reasons why the Christ child at this point is depicted this way. He has much closer to proportions of an adult than he does a baby, right? Because even that, it's off. I mean, it's not accurate adult proportions either, but it's closer than baby because his head's much too tiny. Partially, at least, it's just rejecting naturalism again and intentionally elongating. We're going to see later medieval art will often just elongate these figures in this really elegant way. It's somewhat that influence, but it's also referencing the fact that he's not and never was really a baby. That there are images in art from when he's very tiny, where he's blessing people and, you know, doing things babies don't do, that he was always somehow an adult. He's still Christ, even when he's little. So there's some underlying message that way. It's also, you can't just ignore the fact that it gets to be tradition. This is how, for how many 100 years you've shown something, so this is how you do it. It's just the way it is. Many of these icons by this time they're made in workshops. First of all, a little overview of how icons are made, because it's a good overview of medieval art in general. This is the great age of the craftsman. Art as a concept didn't really exist in the medieval world. Nobody thought of what they were making as art. They were master craftsmen. That's what artists were. And they're largely, almost exclusively anonymous. Individual names were not put on works of art. That was ego. They would come out of a workshop, and many people would have worked on it. Many people would have worked on this icon, not one person. And it would be a project of the shop. And religious images in general had to be approved by the church. You couldn't just paint a scene however you wanted to. And the church would have these approved motifs, and they would be put into books, and they were called workshop books. And every workshop would have books of, okay, we're going to do a Virgin and Child. Let's look up the different options we have for doing that, which is one reason why, you know, icons all look alike. I mean, because they're all following the same approved models, the same approved patterns. So of course you're going to get similarity. This art was not valued by how different it is. I mean, we have so many modern conceptions about art that had no place there. They're not valued for creativity. In fact, creativity is not a word you should even use before the 19th century at the earliest. It has no place in art. Art wasn't really valued by about how different you could be. That's today, where we look at how different. Today, you look at something and say, oh, I've seen that before. Like, that's a bad thing. Like, if anybody's ever done that before, it can't be any good. It has to be something I've never seen before. But it has to be something I've seen before in the Middle Ages for it to be good. Art was valued by the sacredness of its subject and by the materials that you use, the preciousness of the materials that you use. And these are very precious materials. A lot of gold here. Everywhere that it looks orange, that was once gold leaf. The orange is the underpainting, and the thin gold leaf has worn off over time. So orange is gold leaf, was once gold. You see a bit of it is still there. Faces, or why did they paint everybody green? That's why I hear that a lot. Well, they didn't. You're seeing the underpainting. It's called green bowl. And that's what any flesh surfaces were painted as an underpainting, and then flesh would have been on top of it, but it's worn off. So now it looks green. So, you know, things have changed. Also, she would have been originally wearing the beautiful blue mantle that the Virgin Mary always wears. She always wears blue. It's the most expensive color, as expensive as gold leaf. It was the color made from lapis, right? Semi-precious stone from Afghanistan. It was very rare, and therefore that color was reserved for the mantle of the Virgin Mary, the outer garment of the Virgin Mary. However, a lot of the colors, the way they're mixed, were unstable, and this was unstable, and it's turned black. So it would have been a bright blue originally. It's not any longer, but it's very much the Byzantine style. A workshop like this, you would have entered as an apprentice, probably 11, 12, 13 years old, somewhere in there, your early teens, apprentice. And through that, you would have learned, you would spend years learning how to make pigment and collect all the things you needed and grind them up, and how to prepare the boards, the wooden panels. So you learn that basics as an apprentice. The majority of the work is done by the journeyman. You know, if you're really good, after years of this, you could move up and become a journeyman. And then you would learn, you know, how to do hands and fingers, and then you'd learn how to do something else until you totally mastered that. A painting like this would have been sort of a group effort. You know, the best face painter and the best hand painter and the best gold leafer, and whoever, you know, whatever you did, you know, you would do that on this piece. If you were really, really great and you wanted to move up to master, each workshop had one master. If you wanted to be a master or get your master's, you know, credentials, then you could actually go out and open up your own shop. But that was tightly controlled by the guild. Every town, and I'm not actually talking, I'm not talking about Byzantium anymore. I'm talking about Europe and the whole medieval world. Every little town would have a guild for that craft. So there would be like a shoemaker's guild and a furniture makers guild and an icon painters guild. And there's no difference between those. They're all master craftsmen. And let's say there's 3 icon painters workshops. There's 3 masters. So those 3 masters make up the guild, the Icon Painters Guild. And those 3 masters, then they control the exam to get to be a master. So if you want to be a master, you have to take a test. You have to do a practical test where you have to make something from beginning to end. You have to show, you know, every step and every stage of the process. And you also then have to take that work of art and you turn it in, and it's judged. And that piece was known as your master's piece. That's where we get the word masterpiece, right? So you would turn in your master's piece, and then they judge the quality, but they also judge whether the town needs another workshop. I mean, if there's not enough work for all of them, they're not going to give you your papers. I mean, they're controlling the economy, they control the quality, they control the jobs, what goes where, you know, who gets what jobs, they distribute. Exactly, labor unions are based on the guild system. It's based on the guild system, and that's what we have here. So it's a system that really is responsible for the quality of what is made, but it also has a lot to do with why things look the way they do. It's because of that system. You know, when the guild system loosens up, and one of the things we're going to see when we get to the Renaissance is that Italy, the guild system in Italy was never very strong. It's not a coincidence the Renaissance begins there. It's not a coincidence you have artists going out and working more independently and working on their own and working privately, because they weren't as controlled. It's not a coincidence that Northern Europe is the last place for the Renaissance to work, because the guild systems in the North were very strong and they kept out individuality. They wanted to control it. And so it takes about 100 years for the kind of independence to work its way up to the North. And we'll cover all of that and see artists who weren't happy about that and what they did about it. But it all comes back to systems like this. Yeah.
I am blown away by the fact that in the Catholic Church, I recently had the same experience. My father died, and we wanted to make a personal, you know, have a service that's kind of personal. Absolutely not. You choose
Tradition,
Yeah,
institutions
right.
favor tradition because they exist because of tradition. You start changing traditions, you're threatening their existence.
And we were told, this is not about the person who died. This is about Christ.
Oh, wow.
So, but they did let us after the service was over, we could say something about.
Well, you know, that says a lot about institutions. I mean, it basically says they know they aren't really needed, because if if they didn't feel that way, they wouldn't be afraid of you making changes.
Yeah.
You're threatening their existence. Right, and there's, then there's that, yeah.
There's a rabbi, a local rabbi, and he regularly injects Tevye in his, when he's talking about something, he'll say tradition.
Tradition.
Tevye gave us all the information we need about tradition.
Right.
I had a friend who, when her mother died, her mother loved the Viennese waltzes of the church, and it was some Christian church, I don't know, but they wouldn't let her. So they came here.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's strange. I don't understand that. Does anybody have any other questions or comments on anything?
That's the anti-icon.
Thank you.
Yeah,
The anti-icon.
right, the iconoclast.
That appears a lot of places.
It comes up a lot. We're going to see it again at the time of the Protestant Reformation. There's a lot of iconoclasm in that. The early Protestants were iconoclastic and wouldn't allow images in churches. That was a Catholic. Now images are associated with Catholicism. So Protestants no images in churches. Some of them banned. You couldn't own images. Some of them you could, but Protestant churches never had images in them early on.
Was it the Muslims who exploded?
And they're totally iconoclastic in other ways. Yeah, in monotheism, that's where iconoclasm is. You obviously don't find it in polytheistic religions.
And I think some.
What's your
Protestant-
eyes like?
Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
You asked me.
So we'll go back to Western Europe and start there next time.
And I think-
Well, you're welcome.